So to wrap up the Celtic mythology, today we go over the Birth of Taliesin. Now, at first glance, this story is about a witch and a boy. But in fact, it's an initiation into a higher consciousness through the cauldron of rebirth. It's interesting that we end on Taliesin, as he is both a god as well as an actual historical figure around the time of King Arthur. So he was around in the 6th century, and some even attribute him to being Merlin. I'm Enygma. Thanks for joining us. Go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button, as well as that little bell to be notified when any new videos are coming out. Also, see the social media over here and join us in the conversation. We don't really know much about who Taliesin really was, because by the time anything was written to him about the tales of Taliesin in the 14th century, his legend had already become myth. So join me as we explore the story of the birth of Taliesin. So stay a while and listen. Long ago, there was a lady of great magic called Caradwyn, who lived by the shores of Bala Lake. Caradwyn had 2 children, a boy and a girl. The girl was called Caraway, the dear one. She was as fair as the moon upon water. But her other son, Vagdu, his name means darkness. He was ugly. He was crooked. But Caradwyn loved her misshapen son and longed to bring brightness into his life. So she studied the books of the Druids and mastered a secret art of brewing a cauldron of inspiration, 3 drops of which could bestow the knowledge of all things past, present, and future upon her hapless son. She learned under which moon to gather the herbs, under which stars to steep them, and at last, when she had all of the ingredients together, she would cook them in her great iron cauldron for 1 year and 1 day. It just so happened walking along the road was a peasant boy and his father. She reached out to them and said, "Can you watch over my cauldron and help stoke the fire?" Gwynbach, the son, said, "Of course, we would love to help." So for all of that year, Gwynbach stirred and stirred the simmering brew, stoked that fire, and spending his days feeding the fire with twigs and dead leaves, his nights kept warm by its flickering flames, until the time had almost come when the magical brew was ready. And on that last day, Gwynbach stirred the cauldron sunwise for good luck. 3 drops sprang out of the cauldron and landed in his hand, and without thinking about it, the lad sucked the burn and swallowed the 3 drops of inspiration. In that moment, he was filled with a great light that bursts open the horizons of his young mind, and it was as if everything that had ever happened and was going to happen in the world rolled out before him, and infinity made a home in his head. But with his outer eye, he saw Caradwyn coming toward him, her face exploding in anger. So Gwynbach dropped the wooden spoon and he ran. She came close behind, and he heard her footsteps and thundered upon the path. And the boy ran, and his thoughts were, if I was a hare, I could leap to safety. But he knew how. He didn't know why he knew. He leapt and turned into a hare. And as he bounced from this to that, Caradwyn had turned herself into a greyhound. And the hare was swift, but the greyhound was swifter. And soon the little animal could feel her breath on his neck. He bounded on the edge of the lake and leapt into the water, and his thoughts said, if only I could, but I can. And salmon he became and swam through the dark reedy waters of the lake. But Caradwyn leapt into the water and became an otter, and though the salmon was swift, the otter was swifter. Her paws flexed for the kill. But the fish leapt out of water, and in his thoughts he became a bird. He was Crow, beating at the air with his wings, and turned into the crow and flew away. But she leapt out of the water and turned herself into a hawk. And the crow was swift, but the hawk swifter, and swooped down and dug its talons into the neck of the small bird. But at the last minute, he turned into a grain of wheat and dropped down between those cruel talons into the threshing floor of a nearby mill, and there he hid with thousands of grains of wheat. But the hawk turned into a black hen and she fluttered and flew down from the sky into the threshing floor and scratched and pecked until she found the one grain among them, among the many, and swallowed it up. And no sooner had the black hen swallowed the grain of wheat than the great cauldron over the fire rocked one way, rocked another, and with a great crack, it split into two. Black liquid oozed out, dousing the fire and trickling away in a black stream that poisoned the land and all of the horses that grazed there. In the belly of Cerdwin, the grain of wheat began to grow. It grew and grew, and 3 months passed, and then 6 months passed, and she was getting bigger. And when 9 months were over, she lay on her back and gave birth to a baby boy. As soon as the child was born, she took a dagger, for she knew well who he was, and went to slit his throat. She made the mistake of looking into the child's face, and he was so beautiful, and he was her own son, and she couldn't bring herself to kill him. She threw the dagger down with a clatter, and she made a coracle out of hide and pitch, wrapped the baby up in layers of animal skin, and gently placed him in the coracle. Then she tucked it under her arm and strode over the mountains and moorland until she came to the ocean, cast the coracle on the salt, cold waters. The little boat was sent spinning and tossing by the waves and currents and the winds of the sea for many hundreds of years. But in all that time, the child wrapped in skins did not age a single day. Now, many years later, a Welsh prince called Elphin lived at the mouth of River Conway. He was a gambler and heavily in debt. On May Eve, he heard that the salmon were running, and so he said to himself, "Now, if I can stretch some nets across the riverbank, I can catch some salmon and make some money." So he stretched his nets out across the estuary, and all night long he waited there under the bright stars, and in the morning he waded into waters to see what he caught. There he found not one single fish, but caught in the nets was a little coracle encrusted with limpets and barnacles, and inside the coracle lay something wrapped in animal skin. Elphin folded back the skin one by one, and when the last slipped off, there lay a little baby boy smiling up at him. Around his head shone a bright light. Elphin could not believe his eyes. All he could say was, "Look at that shining brow." And in Welsh, that is Taliesin. And so the baby boy was called that from this time forth. And Taliesin grew up to be the greatest poet and prophet that Wales had ever known. And some say he was none other than Merlin himself. So there you have it. That's the story of Taliesin. So what do you think about the comparison between Taliesin and the great Merlin of Arthurian legend? Let us know in the comments below. And of course, if you enjoy the content, hit that like and subscribe button, and hit that bell to be notified when the next video is coming out. Upcoming for the month of December, we're going to explore pagan holidays and how they gave birth and the rise to Christmas. I'm Enygma. We'll see you next time.